I thought I was just noticing her, until she whispered, "I notice more than you think." It started as a simple visit to my friend's house, one of those ordinary afternoons that felt like they could be ignored without consequence. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, I noticed her, my friend's mom, more than I probably should have. She was standing by the counter, a mug of coffee in her hands, the sunlight spilling through the window catching the subtle highlights in her hair. There was something effortless in the way she moved, a kind of grace I hadn't expected in the routine familiarity of her home. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just admiration, respect, maybe even curiosity. But I couldn't shake the way my attention lingered. She laughed at something small my friend said, a soft, melodic sound that filled the room, and I realized I hadn't just been looking at her. I'd been noticing her, truly noticing. The slight crinkle at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the way her hands curled naturally around the mug, the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. Each detail seemed to imprint itself onto me. It wasn't long before she caught me. I felt her gaze, subtle but perceptive, and I looked away quickly, pretending to focus on the vase of flowers on the table. But there was a spark in her expression, a half-smile that hinted she knew exactly what I was thinking. "You notice a lot, don't you?" she said, teasing lightly, as if daring me to admit it. My throat went dry. I managed a small, nervous laugh, trying to play it off, but it was impossible to ignore the fluttering in my chest. There was warmth in the room beyond the coffee and sunlight, something human, something intimate in the mundane. I felt aware of the space between us in a way I hadn't with anyone else before. Every movement she made seemed to resonate, from the tilt of her head as she listened to my friend, to the soft sigh she let out when she settled into the chair across from me. It was quiet, ordinary, but it drew me in. I caught myself imagining small scenarios, helping her with groceries, passing her a book, standing just a little closer than necessary during a conversation. Every thought felt dangerous and thrilling, though I had no intention of acting on them. And yet, in that kitchen, with her sunlight-streaked hair and easy laughter, I realized something unsettling and exciting. She noticed me too. That first parting of glances, brief but electric, set a kind of unspoken rhythm. We shared the room, the coffee, the soft warmth of a winter afternoon, and without a single word beyond polite conversation and gentle teasing, something had shifted. It wasn't romance, at least not yet, but it was the beginning of noticing each other in a way that mattered. It was the start of something that neither of us could fully define, yet both of us felt. And as I left that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about her words, said almost casually, almost teasingly, "You notice a lot, don't you?" I did notice, and I suspected she noticed me too. After that first afternoon, I found myself noticing her more often, even in the smallest of moments. It wasn't just her presence in the room. It was the way she seemed to inhabit the space with a quiet awareness, as if every glance, every gesture, carried meaning. I began to catch myself looking for her. Not in an obvious way, not as if I were staring, but with that delicate, almost unconscious attentiveness that you only reserve for someone who matters more than they should. One evening, I stayed over at my friend's house to help him with a project. She was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, and I offered to help. She raised an eyebrow, half teasing, half indulgent. "Careful with the knife," she said, and for a moment, our hands touched as I reached for a cutting board. A flash of warmth shot through me, sudden and electric, and I quickly withdrew my hand, pretending it hadn't happened. But the look she gave me lingered, a fleeting, knowing smile that made my heart stumble. It wasn't just the casual touches. It was how she noticed the things I didn't think anyone would. She commented on the way I had tied my shoelaces that morning, or the way I adjusted the strap of my backpack, and it was impossible not to feel seen. Not just seen, but observed in a way that mattered. Her voice was gentle but carried a subtle playfulness, a tone that invited attention and reciprocation without demanding it. We began to have these little moments, small interactions that, on the surface, seemed ordinary, but underneath carried an unspoken intimacy. When I helped carry a bag of groceries from the car, she brushed past me slightly, the warmth of her arm lingering against mine. When I passed her a dish from the table, our fingers touched for a second too long. It was all innocent, all ordinary, but charged with a tension that neither of us could name. I started noticing her habits too. The way she hummed softly while cooking, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way her eyes softened when she looked at my friend with maternal pride. And in those details, I felt myself slipping further into an awareness I couldn't control. I knew the line between admiration and something more was fragile, but there was no shame in simply observing, in simply being present. Then there was the moment that stayed with me long after that evening ended. She leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand, and gave me that same half-smile from before, the one that made my stomach clench. "You notice more than you think?" she said quietly, as if acknowledging not just my attention, but my presence in a way that felt intimate, almost conspiratorial. My chest tightened at the words, not because they were romantic, they weren't, not yet, but because they made me feel visible in a way that few people ever did. That evening, I left with a new kind of awareness. I realized this wasn't just admiration anymore. It was the beginning of a connection, fragile and tentative, threaded through glances, touches, and words that hinted at something deeper. And I couldn't help but wonder if she noticed it too. The way I lingered, the way I saw her, the way my attention had shifted from casual to intentional. Over the next few weeks, our interactions grew more layered. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I noticed it. The way her presence seemed to calm the edges of my own restlessness, and how I had become attuned to the smallest details about her. And one evening, as the rain fell softly against the window pane, that quiet awareness transformed into something heavier, more personal. She invited me into the kitchen while I was helping her friend with a late-night project. The rest of the house was quiet. My friend had gone to bed, leaving just the two of us with the soft hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic patter of rain. She leaned against the counter, her eyes distant, and for the first time I noticed a trace of fatigue in her posture, a vulnerability she didn't usually reveal. I stopped chopping the vegetables I'd been helping with, and for a moment, the only sound was our shared breathing. "I don't get many moments like this," she said softly, almost to herself. There was a pause, and then she added, "People, they rarely see what's going on underneath." Her fingers traced the edge of her coffee mug absently. I realized she was talking about more than tiredness, about the invisible weight she carried in her life, the kind of pressures and quiet frustrations that often went unnoticed. Without thinking, I leaned slightly closer, careful not to overstep, and asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" It was the simplest of offers, but the way her eyes met mine made it weighty, charged with a trust one hadn't been given before. She hesitated, then nodded, exhaling as if releasing a small part of her burden. She began to speak, quietly at first, about the subtle loneliness of adulthood, the ways she felt responsible for everyone around her, the moments she wondered if anyone truly noticed. And I listened, not as a boy to a mother, not as an intruder into her life, but as someone who genuinely cared. I let silence fill the spaces between her words, offered nods, and made space for the pauses where emotion might have overflowed. I noticed the faint quiver in her voice, the way she curled her hands around the mug, and the little sighs that punctuated her sentences. Each detail drew me further into her world without crossing boundaries, creating an intimacy that was quietly profound. When she finished, she looked at me, and there it was again, the soft, unspoken acknowledgement that she had shared something private, something precious. Her gaze was steady, warm, and slightly vulnerable, and I felt a strange flutter in my chest, a mix of admiration, protectiveness, and something I didn't yet dare to name. She smiled faintly, almost apologetically, and said, "Thank you for listening. Not many people do." And in that moment, even though nothing had changed outwardly, no touches beyond polite proximity, no declarations, everything had changed. We had crossed a threshold. We had begun to notice each other not just in passing, but in ways that mattered, in ways that could not be unspoken. Walking home later, I felt the weight of that evening settle in my chest. I realized that our connection was no longer casual. It was subtle, understated, yet profound, a quiet acknowledgement that we could see each other in ways that few others could. And I knew, deep down, that neither of us would forget this first real conversation, this first shared vulnerability that had set the stage for everything yet to come. After that quiet evening of confessions, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic or overt. There were no declarations, no sudden changes in behavior, but the air seemed charged in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I began to notice her in moments that once would have seemed ordinary, and I felt, with a strange clarity, that she noticed me just as much. It was during small, everyday encounters. I might pass by the kitchen as she brewed her morning coffee, and I'd catch the way her fingers lingered on the mug, the subtle curve of her lips as she hummed softly to herself. I'd find myself adjusting my posture, my tone, even my glance, aware that she was watching in that quiet, observant way that made me feel seen. And when our eyes met, even for a fraction of a second, there was an unspoken acknowledgement, a fleeting awareness that carried weight beyond simple politeness. One afternoon, I helped her move a stack of books from the shelf to the table. Our hands brushed, a casual contact, but the warmth of her skin lingered longer than expected. We paused, just for a heartbeat, our fingers retreating slowly, as if neither of us wanted to break the fragile connection. The room was silent except for the soft creak of the floorboards, and in that pause, I felt a subtle electricity, a quiet tension that thrummed between us without words. It wasn't just physical proximity, it was the small habits she displayed that drew me in. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear while concentrating. The way she tilted her head when she laughed at something my friend said. The almost imperceptible sigh when she relaxed into the couch after a long day. Each gesture carried a kind of intimacy that I noticed instinctively, and I felt a growing sense of wonder. How could someone radiate both strength and vulnerability in the same glance? I noticed, too, the way she seemed to watch me. The brief, almost imperceptible glances as I reached for something, the subtle lifting of her eyebrows, the way her lips curved in a soft, knowing smile. I caught myself imagining what it would feel like to be closer, to sit a little nearer on the couch, to brush against her hand without hesitation. And yet I didn't act on it. Couldn't. The tension was a careful dance, delicate, restrained, but all the more potent for its restraint. The most telling moment came when we were both standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She handed me a bowl, our hands touching once again, and this time our eyes met fully. There was a quiet acknowledgement in that gaze, not just recognition but curiosity, a silent understanding that we were noticing each other in ways that went beyond casual awareness. And when she smiled, soft and knowing, she didn't look away immediately. Instead, she let the moment hang in the air, unspoken but undeniable. That evening, I walked home feeling a strange mix of exhilaration and restraint. I realized that our connection had deepened without a word of romance being spoken. We were aware of each other in a way that was intimate yet safe, charged yet restrained. And in that awareness, I felt the subtle thrill of something forbidden. Not dangerous, exactly, but delicate and infinitely magnetic. It was in these lingering, silent moments that I first understood the gravity of her presence in my life. She was no longer just my friend's mom. She had become someone whose attention, whose small gestures, whose very being, could unsettle me entirely. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that she felt it too. By now, our awareness of each other had grown into something undeniable, though neither of us had spoken about it outright. It was in the small things. The way she lingered near me as she handed me a plate, the subtle warmth when our hands brushed, the quiet moments when our eyes met across the room. Every interaction carried an undercurrent of tension, a silent acknowledgement that we both felt something more than casual familiarity. But with that awareness came hesitation, a cautiousness born of understanding boundaries and consequences. She was my friend's mother, an adult with a life far more complex than mine, and I was younger, still navigating the edge of my own emotional maturity. Every glance, every touch, was tinged with that knowledge, making the moments charged but careful, restrained yet intimate. One evening, We were sitting in the living room after my friend had gone to bed, helping her organize some old photo albums. Our knees brushed beneath the table. A small contact, almost accidental, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lingered near mine, a subtle invitation to proximity, though never crossing the line. I found myself acutely aware of every detail. The softness of her sweater against my hand, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her hair fell naturally over her shoulder. It was during moments like this that our mutual attraction became almost unbearable in its subtlety. I wanted to say something, to confess the way my heart raced when she smiled at me, or the way my mind lingered on her long after our interactions. But the awareness of the age gap of social propriety held me back. I didn't dare risk words that could ruin the delicate balance we had cultivated. She seemed to feel the same restraint. There were moments when she would glance at me with that familiar softness in her eyes, a look that held curiosity, care, and something more intimate that she refused to name. Sometimes, her fingers would brush against mine as she handed me an item, or she would stand closer than necessary while explaining something, a subtle test of proximity that made my pulse quicken. Yet, she never allowed the moments to become overt, never let the tension tip into something improper. Even ordinary tasks carried weight. Walking together to the mailbox, handing over groceries, passing each other in the kitchen. Each movement felt amplified. Our awareness of each other created a rhythm, a quiet dance of approach and retreat, of lingering touches and deliberate distance. It was exhausting and exhilarating at the same time, a constant push and pull that neither of us could ignore. And yet, in the tension, there was also comfort. There was a warmth in knowing that we were seen, fully observed, without judgment. Every hesitant smile, every fleeting touch, reinforced the connection growing between us. We were both aware of the boundaries, yet aware, too, of something deeper, a connection that transcended the ordinary. By the end of the evening, I left her house feeling both elated and conflicted. My mind replayed every glance, every touch, every unspoken word, and I realized that the line between admiration and something more was thinner than I had imagined. And in that awareness, I understood that neither of us could fully ignore the pull growing between us. Yet we were both bound by hesitation, by propriety, and by the delicate balance of our lives. The tension that had been quietly building between us reached a subtle yet undeniable peak one evening, when the world outside seemed to recede, leaving just the two of us in her living room. It wasn't dramatic, there was no lightning strike or stormy confession, but the air was charged in a way that felt impossible to ignore. Every glance, every small movement carried weight. It started with something simple, a spill of water from the kitchen sink as we prepared tea together. I bent instinctively to help, and our hands met on the counter. Neither of us pulled away immediately. Instead, there was a pause, a brief moment where the warmth of our shared touch lingered, heavy with meaning. Her eyes met mine, soft and steady, and I could feel the quiet acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. The awareness, the teasing glances, the subtle touches that spoke louder than words ever could. We moved to sit together in the living room, teacups in hand, and for a while we simply existed in silence. The quiet was comfortable, intimate even. I noticed the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the way her fingers curled around the handle of her cup, the softness in her gaze that seemed to study me without expectation. I realized then that the attraction, the subtle tension, had deepened into something more complex, a feeling neither casual nor fleeting, but layered with admiration, trust, and unspoken longing. Then she spoke, her voice low and measured. "I trust you, more than I should." There was a vulnerability in her tone that I had rarely heard, a fleeting glimpse of the woman behind the grace and confidence she always carried. I felt the weight of her words, understood the courage it took to admit such a thing without crossing boundaries. My chest tightened as I realized the reciprocity of that trust, the silent agreement that we were both aware of our feelings, yet neither of us had acted recklessly. I wanted to tell her how I felt, to give words to the emotions that had been building in me for weeks, but I stayed silent, letting my attention, my presence, speak for me. I reached out subtly, placing my hand near hers on the armrest, close enough to be felt without overtly touching. She didn't move away. Instead, her fingers brushed mine lightly, a gesture that said everything we both couldn't articulate. We spent the evening in that delicate balance, close enough to feel the warmth of each other, yet careful not to overstep. Every glance, every subtle movement, carried the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. There was no rush, no declaration, only a shared understanding that the connection between us was profound, intimate, and meaningful. By the time I left that night, I realized something important. Our relationship had crossed a threshold. We were no longer just acquaintances, no longer just a young man and his friend's mother. We had become confidants, observers of each other's vulnerabilities and desires, aware of the silent pull that drew us together. And though nothing had been explicitly named, the depth of our unspoken understanding created a quiet fulfillment, a recognition that we had found something rare, fragile, and infinitely significant. The days that followed our quiet understanding were marked by a strange combination of comfort and anticipation. We had acknowledged, without words, that the connection between us was real, layered, and significant. But we had also recognized the delicate boundaries that life, propriety, and circumstance imposed. It was a tension that had settled into something almost like rhythm, familiar yet fragile, tender yet charged. One evening, my friend was away, and I found myself once again in her living room. The warm light of the lamps softened the edges of the room, making the world feel smaller, contained, intimate. She was sitting on the couch, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and she looked up as I entered. There was no teasing, no casual banter this time, just a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that something had shifted permanently between us. I sat across from her, careful to respect the unspoken boundaries, but close enough that our knees brushed slightly. The subtle warmth of her presence filled the room, and for a moment, the world outside seemed distant, almost irrelevant. We talked about everyday things, books, music, the weather, but there was an underlying weight to our conversation, a sense of meaning in each glance, each small gesture. At one point, she reached for the blanket draped over the back of the couch and pulled it around her shoulders. Without thinking, I leaned slightly closer, sharing in that warmth. Our fingers brushed again, light and fleeting, but this time, the gesture carried a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of the bond that had grown between us. It was tender, respectful, and filled with an intimacy that needed no words. She looked at me, her eyes soft, reflective, and just slightly vulnerable. "I notice everything about you," she said quietly, almost a whisper. It wasn't a confession in the dramatic sense, it wasn't about declarations or promises. It was a statement of awareness, of recognition, of care. I felt the weight of those words settle in my chest, warm and grounding, as if they had woven a quiet, unbreakable thread between us. I smiled, and our eyes met in a long, steady gaze. There was no rush, no pressure, only the mutual understanding that what we had was rare, meaningful, and worth protecting. We sat there in quiet companionship, letting the warmth of proximity and shared acknowledgement fill the space between us. Every fleeting touch, every lingering glance, spoke volumes about trust, affection, and a connection that transcended conventional expectations. When it was time for me to leave, we stood at the doorway, close but careful, aware of the gravity of the moment. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear with gentle familiarity, and our hands lingered together for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I could feel the unspoken promise in that touch, that while the path ahead might be uncertain, the bond we had created would remain, enduring, profound, and quietly transformative. As I walked away, I carried with me the warmth of that evening, the realization that we had shared something rare, an age-gap connection that was both respectful and deeply intimate, a slow-burn romance that had grown from noticing, from understanding, and from trust. It wasn't dramatic or fleeting. It was enduring, and it had changed us both forever. If you've ever felt a connection you couldn't explain, or noticed someone in a way no one else did, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that tug at the heart. And let me know in the comments, Have you ever experienced a forbidden attraction that stayed with you?